That showed the world just the depth of the Saudi passion for football and the celebrations in the stadium, the backflip of the goal scorer Al-Dosari. The celebrations across Saudi Arabia showed that Saudis were just as young, fun-loving, passionate about football as people anywhere around the world. And it's an incredible amount for the image of Saudi Arabia as a country changing, a country maybe that you didn't associate in the West as that conservative, austere kingdom. Was actually quite different in practice.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Majlis Markets. As always, I'm your host, Hassan Jivraj. Before we begin today's podcast, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and also follow us on all social media channels at Majlis Markets. But now I'd like to introduce my guest for today's episode, the second time coming on the podcast, Kristian Ulrichsen. Kristian, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
It was really great the first time we met. We got talking on the podcast a while back. I can't remember exactly when. I'll link it in the show notes. But we did a deep dive in all the different Gulf economies, and you gave a really nice political economy answer for all the different countries, with the six GCC countries. But Kristian, since the last podcast, we'll get onto your book and talk about what's happening in Saudi with the football and everything. But what have you been up to since the last podcast?
We're still working at the Baker Institute of Public Policy at Rice University in Houston. I think we've spoken about 2023, which was the year that my previous book came out, which was called Centers of Power in the Arab Gulf States, which was trying to look at different types of power networks and relationships. And then since then, working on this football book, which I began working on in 2023, which came out in 2025, just trying to keep up with the Gulf and all the changes. And of course, we saw the war in Gaza have regional impact. We saw the Iran-Israel strikes in 2024, and then the full-scale 12-day war in 2025, and then the attacks on Qatar, first by Iran, by Israel in the summer last 2025. So I'm just trying to keep up, really, and all these red lines that keep being crossed in terms of security, and just trying to figure out what might happen next.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kristian, I've just returned back from Doha. I was attending Web Summit. It was my first visit to Qatar since 2018. And I know you've visited Qatar and you've written a book about it. I think you've written multiple books on it and articles and things. And Kristian, one thing that struck out to me before we got onto Saudi was since my last visit in 2018, the infrastructure in Qatar is fantastic. Like the walkability around the city, getting a taxi is much easier than it was back in, say, 2014, 15. The metro is fantastic. The tram is fantastic. And just the overall infrastructure. And obviously you can attribute a lot of that to the World Cup in 2022, which obviously was a historic one. The final game itself between Argentina and France was probably one of the best finals or best football matches we've all seen. But I want to talk to you today about Saudi Arabia. You've written this book, like you've mentioned. I think the title is Kingdom of Football, right? Saudi
Kingdom
Arabia.
of Football, Saudi Arabia, and the remaking of world soccer.
Amazing. I'll link it in the show notes. It was a fantastic book, and it gave a really nice, succinct breakdown of the historical breakdown of football in Saudi Arabia. But I guess my first question to you, Kristian, is why did you decide to write a book about football in Saudi Arabia?
Well, firstly, I'm a passionate football fan, lifelong football fan. I've been a football fan now for 40 years. Obviously, the last 20 of those years, I've been reading, writing, and working on the Gulf states every single day. My first job was in February 2006, which is exactly 20 years ago this month. So I guess I'm sort of mid-career into a lifetime of working about the Gulf. And so in 2022, we obviously had the World Cup in Qatar, like you mentioned. We had 12 years of a run-up, which was full of controversy, full of media speculation, some of it informed, some of it not. We saw the full Western gaze fall upon the Gulf, but especially Qatar, often in very unfair ways. And then a week after the World Cup ended, like you say, that magnificent final, which for 80 minutes looked like a boring 2-0 win for Argentina, and then suddenly exploded into life. But the week after the final, we suddenly had Cristiano Ronaldo, who had been sacked by Manchester United during the tournament, announce he was going to Saudi Arabia, to Al Nassr. That was at the end of December 2022. For 6 months, people were wondering, would other people move? Would that be a one-off? Then I begin the book with an anecdote from 1978 when Roberto Rivelino, the captain of Brazil in that year's World Cup, joined Al Hilal. And at the time, it was rumored that other stars would join him. Zico was mentioned as well. It would have been a world record transfer, and it didn't happen. And Rivelino ended up being almost the only big name that went. So I think there was a feeling that would that be the case in 22, 23 with Ronaldo. And then suddenly in the summer of 2023, everything just exploded again. And you had the PIF taking stakes in for the biggest teams, and then a succession of stars moving to Saudi Arabia. So that was at the time in July 2023 that I began thinking that there might be a book in this, not just a book about football, but a book linking football with all the changes taking place in Saudi Arabia today, vis-a-vis 2030 vision, all the projects that are in play, and a book that would link them together using football as a sort of hook to sort of begin to look into more detail everything else that was going on.
I just mentioned to you before we started recording, there was a job offered by Arabian Business or being floated around about a Cristiano Ronaldo reporter, which I think, I don't know who filled that or if they've made it public on their LinkedIn or any kind of like CV profile, but that would have been quite an interesting one. I think there was there was some noise about like Cristiano Ronaldo would help the GDP of Saudi Arabia by just the Twitter followers and Instagram followers he'd bring. Kristian, what do you think is misunderstood about Saudi football in the Western world?
Well, I think it was clear looking at some of the commentary on Qatar that there was a feeling maybe in parts of the West, in the UK or in Scandinavia and Northern European states like Germany especially, that there was no football culture in the Gulf. And especially for Saudi Arabia, that's completely incorrect. We've seen a Saudi league around now 50 years. We've seen Saudi clubs doing incredibly well in the Asian Champions League and other continental tournaments from the onwards, the national team. We're just about to have a World Cup in North America, mainly in the US, and I think all of our generation remember the last time the World Cup was in the US in 1994, and that incredible Saudi performance when they beat Belgium 1-0 from Said Ouaidan, who basically scored a carbon copy of Maradona's goal against England in 1986, going through the entire Belgian team and then slotting home. It was almost a complete copy, and Saudi made the second round for the first and only time. So I think the notion that there's no football culture in the Gulf, or that somehow they don't deserve to have big events, that was something that was very clear in the run-up to Qatar, and I think maybe was reflective of a degree of sort of snobbishness, but certainly skepticism in the West about the rise of the Middle East in global football terms.
But Kristian, like, in saying that, right? Manchester City bought, Abu Dhabi bought Manchester City in 2008. You had GFH from Bahrain, I think, which had a stake in Leeds United. And you've seen other like Gulf, albeit sovereign wealth funds or like parts of the ruling families of these monarchs have bought football clubs. So they're not completely alien to like the European football scene, right?
No, and that began really in 2008. And with the Abu Dhabi takeover of Manchester City led by Sheikh Mansour, brother of Mohammed bin Zayed, and Khaldoon al-Mubarak becoming chairman, and really Manchester City being completely transformed from a middle-ranking club in England to perennial champions and Champions League winners in 2023. We also had around the same time Qatar being awarded the World Cup hosting rights in December 2010, which shocked a lot of people, I think, who did see it coming out of nowhere. And then 2011, Qatar Sports Investment buying Paris Saint-Germain. And again, turning a team that had struggled in France, had only escaped relegation a couple of years before, into perennial French title winners. And again, Champions League winners this last June. So we've seen transformations of teams in Europe from the Gulf investments. Not everyone. You mentioned Leeds and GFH Capital. That didn't work. There was a still obscure story at Notts County in England with some links to a businessman in Bahrain who, it's still unclear what happened, but Sven-Göran Eriksson turned up as manager and Sol Campbell played a single match for them in, I think, the third tier of English football, maybe the fourth tier, back in 2009 or so. And other examples, we had a Qatari sheikh in Malaga who hasn't really worked out. We've had Saudi's Hotel Media in Spain, which again didn't really work out. So it's not a notion that Gulf investment is an automatic ticket to success. And I think there are examples for what makes it successful. The intermediary has to be important. They have to be linked to the resources that can transform a club. Yeah, we've obviously seen transformation at that level. And I mean, for example, the term sportswashing, which has become so prominent over the past few years, didn't even exist in 2008 when Manchester City was taken over. It didn't exist in 2010 when Qatar got the hosting rights for the World Cup. It really began to emerge in the mid-2010s, partly as a result of a reaction to this much greater visibility of Gulf investment, I think, in European football. Where going to the Etihad in London or going to the Emirates in London, going to the Etihad in Manchester is now part of football language. In the old days, you would have said Highbury and Main Road.
as an anecdote, I attended the first ever game at Emirates in 2006 with my father, and we watched Brazil and Argentina play in a friendly.
Wow.
And this is when you had the likes of Rivaldo and Kaká and this little known guy called Lionel Messi, who scored the winning goal right at the end. It was, albeit it was a friendly, but
Yeah.
it was one for the ages, I remember. But Kristian, what surprised you about researching and writing this book?
Well, I think just how rich the history is, and just how interesting, and some of the things we're seeing today have been tried before. For example, I did not know about Jimmy Hill's involvement in Saudi football in the late 70s, hired as a technical director to try and transform the Saudi game, allegedly given a multi-million pound budget, bringing along coaches, managers you would call perhaps old school in the English sense, who weren't able to adapt to living and working in Saudi Arabia, and bringing along David Icke, which was remarkable. I had no idea that David Icke had actually lived and worked in Saudi for a few months. And that didn't last more than a few years. The scheme didn't produce instant results, and I think that's what led to the termination of the agreement. We had at the same time Don Revie leaving the England job in 77 and moving to UAE to become the national team coach. So we had the beginnings there of a long-standing attempt to transform the game, which is obviously what PIF has been doing since 2023. And previous examples didn't necessarily produce instant results. They then faded away. So I think that's what we're reaching to watch this time around, albeit that Jimmy Hill's time did see the introduction of youth leagues, youth teams, and then some in Saudi Arabia think that actually it paved the way for the beginnings of Saudi national team dominance in the Asian game in the 80s and 90s. So it's been done before. It's not as if the last 3 years have never been done or tried in the past.
That is an anomaly in the sense that it has a very large indigenous population compared to, say, some of the other Gulf countries. If you separate Saudi football, you have the 1970s to 1990s, which is the period you've written. You've written about all these three, but you've written 1970s and 1990s, and then you can say 1990s to, say, Vision 2030, so 2016, 2015, and then from 2016 onwards till today. I just want to focus probably more on the latter two, because obviously they have a rich football history. Like, I mean, if you look at Hilal and Nassr and all these other clubs, they go back to the 1950s, some of these clubs, if not even earlier. So, but
Al-Ittihad is formed in 1927, so they're
exactly, yeah, it's a very old club, and it's still going strong today. But before Vision 2030, Kristian, do you think, like a lot of people, or even within Saudi Arabia, they really took football as seriously as they are now?
Possibly. I mean, we obviously saw 1994, the World Cup. This sort of huge enthusiasm in Saudi when the team performed so well. Now, in subsequent World Cups, there was a lull in performance. You remember the 8-0 against Germany in 2002. There was a heavy defeat in 2006 against Spain, I think 4-0 or something, and then 5-0 against Russia in 2018. There was a period when I think football began to fall away in terms of performance. Maybe it was also a result of underinvestment or the general sort of lagging behind in parts of the Saudi economy in the 2000s, early 2010s, before the current leadership became prominent in 2015. I think there's always been interest. There's always been the packed out stadiums for the big games. Again, one of the criticisms of the last few years is that maybe that isn't unifying across the entire league. You get the falling away of attendances. But I think certainly there's always been popular passion about football in Saudi Arabia. You've seen consistent, strong performance by the national team on the Asian level, and then by leading club teams at the Asian Continental Championships. So there's always been, I think, that level of interest and passion.
But you could really say that it accelerated with the Qatar World Cup being awarded to them in 2010, and then Vision 2030 in 2016, right? These two events, and then obviously from 2016 onwards, it's just been like more acceleration, right?
Well, I think with Vision 2030, the Saudis didn't necessarily have a vision for sport at the time, but quickly were able to evolve and adapt the vision to include sport. You also had the beginnings of a privatization project in late 2010s, which included plans to privatize Saudi clubs. Now, again, that had been tried in the past without any real success. It was another example of trying to do something that had been tried before, albeit perhaps with more top-down drive this time around. And again, I think a lot of things shifted after the pandemic, in the sense that Vision 2030 was announced in 2016. The first few years, you had a succession of these Giga-Projects being announced, like Neom, which was announced in 2017, and then you had a pandemic. Lockdown stopped everything for about a year, So post-2020, you began to have a much greater shift in focus towards sport. Now, he's had some of the big boxing matches beginning to take place in 2018, 2019. You had some of the Super Cup for Italy and Spain happening as well. But everything seemed to pick up a gear after the pandemic. And of course, just talking about the World Cup, you then had Saudi Arabia beating Argentina in their opening match in Qatar in 2022. And I mean, that showed the world just the depth of the Saudi passion for football and the celebrations in the stadium, the backflip of the goal scorer Al-Dosari. The celebrations across Saudi Arabia showed that Saudis were just as young, fun-loving, passionate about football as people anywhere around the world. And it's an incredible amount for the image of Saudi Arabia as a country changing, a country maybe that you didn't associate in the West as that conservative, austere kingdom. Is actually quite different in practice.
And then with the Vision 2030, obviously the big drive is to attract FDI, foreign direct investment, to develop and diversify the economy. How does football and by extension sports play a role within their economic diversification efforts?
Well, I mean, there's several angles to that. One is the public health angle, trying to get Saudis to exercise, to play and engage in sport. And the current Saudi ambassador to the US, Princess Rima bin Bandar, has been heavily involved in that. Also from before she became ambassador in 2019, and especially for getting girls and women into exercise and sports. So there's a public health initiative, a well-being sense as well. And then I think in terms of using sport for economic benefit, there's a huge focus in Vision 2030 on tourism, which is supposed to account, I think, up to 10% of GDP by 2030. And using sport, I think, as a vehicle to publicize a lot of the changes taking place so that Saudi Arabia is positioned as a destination. I mean, it's one thing to build a resort on the Red Sea, but if people think, oh, Saudi Arabia, I can't get a visa, I can't go, there's nothing to do, then they won't come. So using sport to try to spread awareness of something changing, and then, of course, with local job creation too in the kingdom, I think that is one of the vehicles. And that's what Mohammed Salman said in 2023. He gave an interview at Fox News in the US, and he was asked about sports washing, and he said, well, if it adds 1% to my GDP, that's what I will do. They're looking for economic gain and benefit, and sport can be a way of publicizing that message outside Saudi Arabia of the kingdom as a destination for people that might want to live, work, or play a round of golf in the kingdom at some point.
They haven't just done it for football and some of the more popular sports. They've done it for things like golf and tennis. And obviously you can talk about things like them setting up their own leagues and own associations like Live Golf. How significant was that, both in terms of putting Saudi Arabia on the map, if you want to call it that, and also challenging the status quo of the existing leagues?
Well, I think Live Golf is in a sort of league of its own, in a sense, if you excuse the pun about the league. For example, when Saudi Arabia bought Newcastle, they took an 80% stake, which is now, I think, 85% stake in Newcastle in 2021. They weren't challenging the Premier League. They were buying 1 out of 20 clubs in the Premier League. It would be a club at the time looked like it might fall out of the Premier League. And the Saudis organize a Grand Prix in Jeddah, for example. It's 1 out of, I think, 24 Grand Prix. So not trying to set up a rival circuit. So I think Live was different in the sense that the Saudis were full on taking on the PGA Tour and really trying to establish their own ecosystem. So that was qualitatively different in terms of the approach. Because in other sports, like in tennis, in cricket, for example, the Saudis are working within the system. They're supporting the status quo. They're supporting the existing ecosystem of sport. In golf, where they've challenged it, in similar ways that, say, Abu Dhabi and Manchester City have constantly challenged the authorities in football, whereas the Saudis with Newcastle haven't done that. They've stayed within financial fair play regulations, which means that Newcastle hasn't become instantly successful to the same extent that Manchester City did after 2008, or before that Chelsea after Roman Abramovich took them over in 2003. We haven't seen that sudden transformation, partly because the rules are much tighter now than they were 20 years ago, even 15 years ago. But in Live, it was a full-on frontal assault. And that perhaps was also partly to do with Yasser Al-Mayan, the governor of the Public Investment Fund, personally being a golf fanatic. It's something clearly of interest to him. I think there were ways of getting close to President Trump, who then was out of office in 2022, 2023. And I think using golf to spread that message to a wide, fluent Middle America audience, kind of beyond the Beltway, which is what Princess Rima has been trying to do as well. spread that message not just to the normal sort of political types, but to a constituency of affluent middle-class Americans who might realize that something interesting is happening in Saudi and might be among the residents and visitors who will go to the Giga-Projects once, if and when they open.
Of course, all of this wouldn't be possible with the involvement of the Public Investment Fund. Since 2015, when Mohammed bin Salman became, I think, the chair of the Public Investment Fund, and he took over a lot of the responsibilities, how significant have they been in terms of like propelling all of this? I think like they've been like the main key driver in this. This hasn't been like an organic thing, right?
No, I think the organic nature was the Saudi win over Argentina, which was bottom up, massive spontaneity in the celebrations, which is why it resonated so strongly. As you mentioned, the Public Investment Fund has been around since 1971. For the first 44 years, it was mostly an inward-focused domestic investment entity that held the government stake in domestic industries. It was housed within the Ministry of Finance, and sovereign wealth funds became a topic of study in the late 2000s, around the time of the global financial crisis, as you'll know and you remember. And at the time, some of the first rankings of sovereign wealth funds and the first journal articles or books that began to look at sovereign wealth funds wouldn't even include the PIF as one of them. And they would often say that Saudi Arabia doesn't have a sovereign wealth fund. But to the extent that they looked at Saudi Arabia, it would be the Saudi Arabia Monetary Agency, SAMA. So PIF kind of emerged from obscurity in March 2015. So 2 months after Salman became king, Mohammed bin Salman was still only the Minister of Defense at the time. He hadn't yet become Deputy Crown Prince the following month. But the oversight of the PIF was then transferred from the Ministry of Finance to the Royal Court, so under his oversight. And then he became chairman of the board and handpicked Yasser Al-Rumayyan to become governor, and they really worked together at the sort of leadership level and the technocratic level to transform the PIF and to make it into a much more active, proactive, assertive, and also international entity that became synonymous with not just the Giga-Projects, because every big project announced by Mohammed bin Salman since 2017 has been entrusted to the PIF or to its subsidiaries for development. But they became also synonymous with all the sporting outreach as well, if golf or buying Newcastle United, or obviously Aramco has been part of, kind of linked to PIF since 2019. And Aramco has led a lot of sponsorship in cricket, for example, and in tennis. So really becomes synonymous with the Saudi sporting scene.
And then since, as you mentioned before, 2023, when Cristiano Ronaldo came in, and then you had this flurry of other players, Ivan Toney, he came, in Benzema. If you listen to Talk Sport Radio, which I do occasionally from time to time, and ESPN,
Yes.
and some of these things, a lot of them criticize players who go to Saudi Arabia. They just see it as a retirement home because they're past their prime. But then you saw this influx of like younger players coming to Saudi. So it's not necessarily it's a retirement home, right, for the past glories.
No, and to some extent, even the Premier League in the early 90s, the first years of the Premier League, you had some of the first foreign stars coming, and they were also late 20s, early 30s. They were also coming to England to retire. It was only later in the 1990s that you began to have foreign stars coming in their youth, in their prime. Maybe Zola was one of the first. If you think that some of the others, Bergkamp as well, but some of the others that came, Gullit, for example, or Vialli, they were also entering the twilight of their careers. So it's not unique to Saudi Arabia. And I think the fact that many of the stars that then moved in 23, 24 were not only younger, but like Nacho in Spain, they were also important players in the European Championships in 2024 in Germany. It showed that it wasn't necessarily the end of your career to move to Saudi Arabia. You could continue to perform at a higher level. There were some that didn't work out. Obviously, Jordan Henderson lasted only a few months, didn't seem to adapt to working in the heat and humidity of the eastern province. Interestingly, he lived in Bahrain, so did Steven Gerrard, which is interesting in a sense that it was maybe a commentary on the different offerings from Saudi Arabia versus Bahrain, and of course Dubai, in terms of lifestyle. So they didn't work out. So Neymar got injured and played, I think, only 5 games for Al Hilal before never really coming back from his injury, leaving to join Santos. So they haven't all worked out, but by and large, most of the players have continued to perform at a higher level and will be featuring at the World Cup. And one of the Saudi strategies in 2023 was to sign players for 3-year contracts to take them up to the World Cup in North America this summer. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens next. We've just seen Benzema, for example, move from Etihad to Al Hilal. So he moved one PIF control team to another, staying in Saudi, but he's obviously 38. Cristiano Ronaldo is 41. They won't be around forever. So is there going to be a next generation or a next wave of stars to take their place? Or will this be that sort of one-off that they played for 3 years and they left? So I think that's why the Saudi pursuit of someone like Mohamed Salah, for example, is so important. Will he be the next big superstar to almost take over from Cristiano Ronaldo, from Karim Benzema, and take Saudi football to the next 3-4 years? Or will it just be a one-off when they came in 23? And obviously by 2026, financial conditions in Saudi have changed and there's not maybe the same amount of money they can put into the project that there was in 2023.
Do you think also the way in which they broadcast the games, like for example here in the UK, you can watch Saudi Pro League on YouTube. I think in Saudi Arabia itself, there's the podcast host Thamania, they host a lot of the Saudi games too. So do you think the medium of which these broadcasts are done also play a role in its propelling it to the outer world?
I think so. And I mean, people have looked at the fact that some of the viewership is very low for entire games, or that it's not available on mainstream broadcasting. From the beginning, since 2023 at least, the Saudi Pro League officials have been quite clear that they're looking at this in a different way. You're mixing sport and entertainment, packaging clips for social media, for 3-4 minute clips on YouTube or TikTok, for example. And it's not necessarily a 90-minute package where people will watch the entire game. But if you can have 3-4 minutes of a packed-out stadium with Etihad playing against Hilal, the sort of super classico in Saudi terms, that's what they will be trying to attract. And they, I think, have identified changes in viewership patterns, especially among younger fans, and also fans from around the world, who are not just European, kind of maybe, as was sort of time, the European Super League legacy fans. So the patterns are changing around the world and how we consume and engage with entertainment and with sport. So I think the authorities were trying to be on the tip of that change and not maybe trying to resist it, perhaps. You might see that in more of a European context, so to try to embrace that change. So I think that's what they have been trying to do. And obviously, the local podcast scene in Saudi Arabia is clearly supporting that in terms of generating excitement and analysis that hopefully, in their view, will drive people to engage with the game and go to the matches.
We've obviously talked about the PIF's involvement and how important they are, not just as propelling all of this, but also as the fiscal anchor. And there's been a lot of controversies. I don't know if it's the right word, but Cristiano Ronaldo was reportedly on a strike the last couple of games until very recently, because he was unhappy that Nassr didn't have an active transfer window, and obviously Nassr is owned by the PIF, is one of the 4 clubs. How important is the PIF's financial impact on the Saudi League?
Well, as you say, in 2023, the PIF took 75% stakes in Al Nassr, Al Hilal, Al Ittihad, and Al Ahly. They're the 4 big teams, 2 in Riyadh, 2 in Jeddah. And they also transferred 4 other teams to entities linked to the PIF. So Aramco took over Qazia, which has now done extremely well over the last several years. There was a team transferred to Neom, which has, again, been shooting up the Saudi pyramids, Alula and Antaria as well. They've also been kind of getting promoted. There's been a lot of money put in. I think the aim was to eventually prepare these teams for sale to private sector investors. That's why it was announced as privatization, even though maybe to Western eyes it looked more like a nationalization. The PIF and sovereign wealth fund linked to the Saudi state taking the stakes, but they call it a privatization. We've seen a couple of teams being privatized in summer of 2025. There's an American investor in Al Khulud in Qasim province, but none of the big 4 have yet moved into that privatization phase, although there are persistent rumors, for example, that Prince Al Walid bin Talal, probably the biggest Al Hilal fan around, Kingdom Holding, one of the most prominent royal business people in Saudi Arabia, are consistent rumors that he will take the 75% stake, but again, we're waiting details. I mean, that would be one way of monetizing the teams themselves, the clubs, and obviously taking them off the PIF list, asset sheet. There's also been plans in Live Golf to privatize the franchises in golf. Golf isn't really known as a team game. It's much more known as an individual game. So that might be more difficult. And I think they haven't found valuations for the franchises in golf that will match what they were hoping for. But we saw, for example, in England in the 2025, we saw massive interest in the privatization of the franchises with 100 in cricket that exceeded all expectations. Now, part of it was Indian Premier League owners coming in, but it could work. And I think it's more likely to work in football just because there's so much more depth of interest in a market for football than there is maybe for golf as a team game. So I think seeing what happens with the PIF and the 4 teams they have will be something to watch.
But do you think like these big giga projects, as they're called, and some of these other big purchases that they've made will have an impact on the league going forward?
I mean, they could do, since PIF is so central to the project, and we've obviously seen some of the projects, the giga projects, being massively scaled down. So the line, for example, which was initially supposed to be 100 miles in length, is then, I think, scaled back to a mile at most. And even that is maybe uncertain. Neom seems to be being repurposed to AI focus and data centers, which may make more sense. And certainly a commentary on where the Saudi economic focus is in 2026 rather than in 2017 shifted, it's evolved. We've seen just the last few weeks the probably overly ambitious attempt to build a winter resort in the mountains of Neom at Trojena being effectively scrapped. I mean, it was postponed, but I think maybe there's doubt that anything will be a winter resort will ever be built at all. The Saudis had to hand back the hosting rights to the 2029 Asian Winter Games, which will now be taking place in Kazakhstan. And I mean, at the time, I think there was an attempt to say, well, they may happen in Saudi Arabia at some point in the future, just not in 3 years' time. But yeah, we have seen a lot of resources being spent on projects that have been scaled back. I think that's indicative of the fact that there's a cash crunch in Saudi Arabia now that there maybe wasn't in 2021, 22, when some of these projects were announced. Oil prices back then had spiked because of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. They're now much lower. There has been less foreign investment in Saudi Arabia than had been anticipated. I think in 2017 there was a hope or an expectation in Saudi that a lot of the giga projects would attract a lot of foreign investment. Fortunately for the leadership, he almost announced in October 2017 at the first Future Investment Initiative at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. A week later, the Ritz-Carlton became a detention center for many of the business elite in Saudi Arabia, who might have been expected to be the business partners of foreign investors coming in. And so that really shook investor confidence, and it really hasn't almost recovered even since 9 years down the line. So the Saudis having to fund the projects a lot more themselves. And there's obviously questions now about the allocation of more scarce resources. How do you allocate them among so many different competing projects? And of course, 2030 is coming closer. It's now 4 years away. I think there's pressure on the leadership to show some tangible outcome because just so much has been put on Vision 2030 as this project of transformative change. Say about the World Cup actually in 2034 in Saudi is that it now extends the time horizon, kind of extends by 4 years. The big date in Saudi Arabia is no longer 2030, it's now 2034. So it kind of gives a buffer zone of sorts. It gives 4 years of extra time to try and ensure that there is at least something that is built. But that's, of course, just some of the external aspects of Vision 2030. I mean, some of the internal ones, like increasing the number of women in the workforce, have already been surpassed years ahead of schedule. So it's a lot of the external ones that maybe international analysts pay most attention to. They're the ones that have been scaled back to the greatest extent.
I visited Saudi Arabia in October 2017 for the first time, and then my last visit was in October just now, gone in 2025. Attended a conference there, and just the scale of change was just really unbelievable to see. It kind of gave me a little bit feeling like Dubai, in the sense a lot more liberal than it was, say, back in 2017. So I think there's been a lot of positive changes which have happened there as well. But one thing is interesting is if you look at the PIF, I agree with you. Like a lot of it has scaled back, but at the same time, Kristian, I follow the debt markets as well and the financial markets in this region. The debt levels have really spiked a lot. And when I talk to bankers or fund managers, a lot of them say, yeah, debt levels have gone up. And if you look at Saudi banks themselves, a lot of them are issuing. Like before 2017, you would never have seen Saudi banks issuing so much debt as they are now. And one of the reasons they're telling me that they're doing this is because a lot of the banks are funding this themselves. It's not coming from foreign direct investment. So I guess, like, are you not worried that Saudi Arabia is fueling a lot of this through debt? And
it seems they have been doing so, as you noted, and I mean they can certainly carry that debt for some time. I mean, we obviously saw increasing debt in the 1980s and 90s, especially in the 1990s and early 2000s, before oil prices spiked after 2003. I mean, the Saudi fundamentals are in pretty good shape, but yes, the spike in levels isn't maybe something they can live with forever. And I think that's why they're allocating resources more strategically now, and that makes sense. And it makes sense to be more discerning about some of the projects, just because some of the plans for the line or for Trojena or maybe for the Mukab, that cube in the Riyadh, were always just fanciful in terms of their grandiosity. And you have to wonder to what extent these were consultants from the West or elsewhere who were pitching these giant projects just to see if the Saudis would bite. And if these are the projects that are being scaled back, that arguably is a good thing because it means that it's more likely to focus resources on the projects that actually make economic sense. And I would argue that football does make more sense to focus on, especially given the World Cup in 2034. They will have to build, they say they will build, I think, 11 new stadiums. So, there's going to have to be a lot of allocation of resources for that. And we saw in Qatar, obviously, how much infrastructure accompanies a stadium build as well. The Qataris also scaled back some of their World Cup plans in 2014, 2015 at a time of previous low oil prices. The initial plan in Qatar was for 12 stadiums. They ended up using 8. Now, the World Cup in 2034 is bigger. It's 48 teams instead of 32. So, maybe they'll scale back 1 or 2 stadiums. The stadium in Neom, which allegedly was going to be up in the air, may not be built. But yeah, by allocating resources more strategically, that is arguably a good thing in the grander scheme of things.
Do you think part of the reason there hasn't been as much levels of inward FDI is because the business environment is still difficult to navigate within Saudi?
Well, I think maybe there's concern among many that the PIF has crowded out a lot of the activity and that so many projects are entrusted to the PIF that it makes more sense to work with the PIF rather than with a generally private sector entity. So I think there's a concern there that the PIF is so omnipresent that genuine private sector activity is harder to define.
Yeah, because they're doing a lot of steps, right? For example, they've lifted, I don't know if you've seen, but they've lifted the QFI, the qualified investments for the local equity market. They're talking about foreign owners. You can have foreign ownership of companies. They're opening up other sectors. The most prominent one is the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. So they're trying to get real estate. So they're doing a lot of things trying to get all this FDI, and they're trying also to reform their contract system and how you can do arbitration and things like that. So they obviously are trying, but at the end of the day, it's still quite reliant on oil prices, right? And where oil is going.
Yeah, and a lot of the reforms will probably take a few years to feed into tangible outcomes in terms of investor confidence. Saudi Arabia has had maybe an image in the past that hasn't helped, obviously with 2017, the Ritz-Carlton being an example. So I think it'll take some time for the impacts of those changes to really make themselves felt. And that time isn't necessarily on Mohammed bin Salman's side, at least for 2030. I think maybe for longer term, that will be something they can work with and take advantage of. But certainly for 2030 seemed a long time in the future in 2016. But of course, now it's really just around the corner.
Very true. As we've been in the podcast to close, one of the things that you mentioned in the book, and you've just mentioned on this podcast as well, is sports washing. How do you characterize sports washing?
When we started working on the book in 2023, there were, I think, maybe 3 journal articles about sports washing that had appeared in academic journals. And the last count over Christmas, I looked, and I think there were about between 25 and 30. So we can actually begin to say that there's an academic literature on sports washing that's beginning to emerge. It wasn't there in the past. 2022 was maybe the peak year of the use of sports washing as a media term, as a pejorative media label. 2022 was called the year of the sports wash because you had the Winter Olympics in Beijing in the beginning of the year and the World Cup in Qatar at the end of the year. But at the time, as a media label, it was often deployed in one direction from the West towards the non-West or authoritarian states. And a lot of the literature that's emerged is incredibly critical of the label. It's slippery, hard to pin down, it's selective, it ignores the fact that the West sports washes. Obviously the Olympics in Berlin in 1936 being one example very early on. You could argue the Rumble in the Jungle in what is now Congo in Zaire back then in 1975 with Muhammad Ali was an attempt to sports wash. Countries like Germany in 2006 having the World Cup and kind of really announcing Germany's sort of return post, kind of finally putting the past behind it was an attempt to sports wash. The Salt Lake City Winter Olympics in 2002, announcing US strength post 9/11 to an external audience. There's also been criticism that what does sports washing mean? How do you actually do it? Who's the audience? Do you sports wash by an event like the World Cup? Or do you sports wash by an investment like Manchester City? If so, which one is more effective? I would argue the investment is much more effective just because fans are so passionate about their club. You won't find Manchester City fans saying anything negative about Abu Dhabi or Newcastle fans doing the same about Saudi Arabia. But as Qatar found with the World Cup. People enjoy the World Cup. They just don't necessarily love where it's being hosted. And you could argue that you can't control the audience. Qatar arguably came out of the World Cup, at least in the West, with a more critical reputation. People all around the world, especially in Europe and North America, maybe knew a lot more about migrant worker issues and labor abuses they would have done on the kafala system than they would have done had Qatar not spent 12 years in the spotlight. So you can't also control the audience. But then, of course, that opens up questions about media framing. Who does the media framing? How does that work? And so there's a literature now that's really beginning to pick apart the term. And I think even some of the proponents in the UK who went to Saudi Arabia the last few years, who looked at the World Cup critically, have actually said, yes, it's not necessarily a fair label. I mean, you can link it to tangible economic outcomes. Saudi Arabia isn't sports washing just to improve the image for the sake of it. They're engaging because improving the image is part of the spreading the message about Saudi Arabia as a destination, which then ties into the tourism aspects of Vision 2030. There's a reason for it. It makes economic sense to have this link. It's not just that they're trying to move beyond Khashoggi or Yemen or 9/11 further back.
It seems a lot of it is a bit unfairly. Like I know that in Qatar there was especially towards the beginning of the competition in late 21, early 22, and towards, like you said the likes of Piers Morgan, who was like criticizing, and I don't know if you remember the campaign by Brewdog, which was saying it wouldn't
Yes.
serve something like this, and then all of a sudden now everyone, they changed their tune afterwards. But
well, it was Russia, Qatar. What next? North Korea, I think.
Yeah, exactly, which I thought is a little bit unfair to say.
But then
that
they were
to
selling
Qatar,
beer with it. Well, they were shipping beer to Qatar to sell to English football fans outside
exactly,
the stadiums.
exactly.
So they were quite happy to make money out of it.
Yeah, but the idea of 2034 World Cup, you've talked about how important it is and how pivotal it is, and it seems now everyone's focusing. Saudis are now focusing on 2034 rather than 2030. What do you think the main challenges are for them going into 2034 for the World Cup?
Well, first of all, I would say that in 2010, when Qatar became the first Middle Eastern, the first Gulf state to be announced as a host, I mean, there was a shock. I mean, there was a sense that this isn't right among many in the West. What was really interesting about the Saudi bid in 2023 and then awards of the hosting in 24 was almost like a collective shrug of the shoulders. Accepted it. Of course it's to happen. It was bound to happen, even though even just 5 years before it would have seemed very unlikely. But the Saudi-FIFA relationship has been building steadily since at least 2020, 2018, when Infantino sat with Mohammed Salman and Vladimir Putin at the first game of the Russia World Cup. To the extent that when the Saudis were awarded the World Cup, people didn't really make anything like the same reaction that we saw with Qatar. And to some extent, people remember the first. They don't remember the second. And this could be to Saudi Arabia's advantage in the sense that Qatar took all the heat of having a World Cup in the Middle East, as you say, with sort of Orientalist views towards that, the sense that it wasn't deserving, it shouldn't be there. Qatar took a lot of that kind of heat. It's easy to see whether anything like that is directed at Saudi Arabia over the next 8 years, or whether Saudis also there's a focus on similar issues, the kafala system or labor issues, LGBTQ issues close to the tournament, or whether there was just a blast for the first and the second just kind of goes ahead in the slipstream and there's not as much. I mean, I think in terms of challenges, it's building stadiums. If they're going to build 11 new stadiums, I mean, there's 8 years, which is a long time, but the resources have to be there. The infrastructure, obviously, some of it is there. The Riyadh Metro, I think, is finally opened many years late. So, I mean, it's getting easier to get around, but there's still problems of congestion. So there's going to have to heavy infrastructure investments, as we saw at Qatar as well. If it's just one sport, football, then that's something that can be doable. Obviously, the Saudis have other big events to think about too. I mean, they have the 2030 Expo in Riyadh and then the 2034 Asian Games. Now, to some extent, they can reuse stadiums. They have 2027 Asian Cup as well. And that gives a pipeline of steady events for the reuse of existing infrastructure. But they will have to build 11 new stadiums, which obviously given FIFA standards, they'll have to be large, modern stadiums, which, is doable, but they'll have to start at some point. And just given the scaling back of projects, that makes it more likely that they'll be the ones that are focusing on over the next few years.
Kristian, tell us any projects you're working on, any upcoming projects you may be working on.
Well, I'm actually doing a lot of work on sport at the moment, just because of the World Cup in the US and obviously Canada and Mexico. There's a lot of interest in the US about diplomacy of sport and sport as a tool of soft power. So I've been doing a lot of work on that, and there's a lot of events in the US in the run up to the World Cup, and then of course to the Olympics in the US in 2028 in Los Angeles as well. So there's a big focus on sport and how sport fits into political, economic, diplomatic trends more widely. So that's a lot of what I'm doing right now, actually.
Great. And the book is available on Amazon and anywhere else?
Well, it should be. Hopefully, it should be available in good bookshops as well, and online too at the Hearst website in the UK, Hearst and Co. And then in the US or North America, it's at Oxford University Press. Now it's published at the beginning of February, so it should be out online or in bookshops if you can find them.
I'll link it in show notes. What's the best way to reach you, Kristian?
Well, you can reach me on the Baker Institute website, or I'm also on Twitter, Dr_Ulrichsen as well, and LinkedIn, and so yeah, a combination of traditional and new social media outlets.
Amazing. Kristian Ulrichsen, this has been a great part two. We definitely need a part three coming up soon, but no, thanks for coming on the podcast.
No, thank you for having me.
Thank you.